When humans first populated North America and how they arrived has long been a matter of spirited debate.
We can definitively say that human beings were present here at White Sands during the last glacial maximum, and that is far older than they have been confirmed anywhere else in North or South America.
In September 2021, a team of researchers from the U.S. Geological Survey, Cornell University, and Bournemouth University in England publishes a paper in the journal Science that detonates a bomb in the middle of everything we thought we knew about when humans arrived in the Americas. The paper says they have found human footprints in the dried bed of an ancient lake in White Sands National Park, New Mexico. Footprints that are between 21,000 and 23,000 years old. That should be impossible. For decades, the established scientific consensus has been that humans first entered North America roughly 13,000 years ago, crossing a land bridge from Siberia to Alaska called Beringia during the last ice age, and then spreading southward through an ice-free corridor between two massive glaciers. The earliest accepted culture, Clovis, dates to around 13,000 years ago. Every textbook, every museum exhibit, every college course on American prehistory tells the same story. Humans arrived 13,000 years ago, period. The White Sands footprints say that is wrong by at least 10,000 years. Humans were walking in what is now New Mexico a full 10 millennia before the Clovis culture existed, before the ice-free corridor opened, before the land bridge was passable by the conventional route. And the footprints are not from one person on one day. They span roughly 2,000 years of continuous human presence, from 23,000 to 21. Zeros and years ago, during the last glacial maximum when North America was covered in ice sheets up to 2 miles thick, the question that exploded across the scientific world was immediate and devastating. If the ice-free corridor was sealed shut by a mile of glacial ice, how did they get here? Did they walk along the coast? Did they take boats across the open Pacific? Did they arrive by a route that nobody has even proposed yet? And if they have been here for 23, zero zeros, what else have we been wrong about? In 2023 and 2025, independent teams using different dating methods and AI-enhanced analysis confirmed the ages. The footprints are real, the dates are real. And the story we have been telling ourselves about human history in the Americas is at least 10,000 years wrong. White Sands National Park covers 275 square miles of gypsum desert in south-central New Mexico. The landscape is surreal, vast white dunes of crystallized gypsum that shimmer in the heat like snow stretching to the horizon in every direction. It looks like another planet. In summer, the surface temperature can reach 150 degrees Fahrenheit. In winter, snow dusts the white dunes and makes them indistinguishable from the sky. It is one of the most inhospitable places in the continental United States. And beneath those dunes and the flat alkali beds between them lies the dried floor of Lake Otero, an ancient body of water that existed during the Pleistocene epoch and dried up as the climate warmed after the last ice age. Lake Otero was once massive, roughly 1,500 square miles of cold, shallow freshwater surrounded by grasslands where mammoths, camels, giant ground sloths, and dire wolves roamed. The first fossilized footprints in the area were noticed in 2009 by David Bustos, the park's resource program manager. Bustos was conducting a routine survey of the alkali flats when he spotted what appeared to be human tracks in a layer of hardened sediment exposed by wind erosion. He had been working in the park for years and had seen animal tracks before. Mammoth prints are common at White Sands, but these were different. They were unmistakably human, the shape of a bare foot, 5 toes, an arch, a heel. He marked the location and came back with colleagues. Over the following years, they documented not dozens, not hundreds, but thousands of tracks, human footprints of all sizes, from adults with feet, roughly size 10 to teenagers with feet around size 6 to small children, whose prints were barely 4 inches long, alongside the tracks of mammoths, giant ground sloths, dire wolves, American lions, and other megafauna that went extinct at the end of the Pleistocene. The footprints are remarkably well preserved. They were made in soft, wet mud at the edge of the ancient lake, the kind of fine-grained clay that records detail with extraordinary fidelity, then covered by layers of wind-blown and waterborne sediment that hardened over millennia into a natural time capsule. Each footprint captures a fraction of a second frozen in stone. The toes pressed into the mud, the arch of the foot visible, the ball of the foot where the weight transferred, the heel strike clearly defined where the walker pushed off for the next step. And it is the stories that the individual tracks tell that make this discovery so devastating. Because these are not just data points. They are people. One sequence, designated by the researchers as the long walk, shows a person, based on the foot size, likely a woman or a teenage male, walking roughly a mile in one direction and then returning along a nearly identical path. On the outbound journey, the footprints are deeper on one side and the stride is shorter than normal, the biomechanical signature of someone carrying a heavy load on one hip. The researchers concluded the walker was carrying a small child. At several points along the outbound route, the child was apparently put down. There are tiny toddler footprints that appear for a few steps and then vanish replaced by the return of the deeper asymmetric adult prints as the child was picked up again. On the return journey, the footprints are shallower and the stride is longer. The child was not being carried. It had been left somewhere, perhaps with another group, perhaps at a camp, and the walker came back alone. This is not a fossil. It is a story of a mother or an older sibling carrying a child through a dangerous landscape inhabited by mammoths and predators, walking over a mile to deliver the child somewhere safe, and then walking back alone 23,000 years ago, in a place that, according to every textbook published before 2021, should have been empty of humans for another 10 millennia. Another track sequence shows what appears to be a stalking event. Human footprints follow mammoth tracks across a mudflat. At one point, the human footprints stepped directly inside the mammoth tracks. The person was literally walking in the animal's footstep, probably to mask their own presence. The tracks converge at a point where the mammoth appears to have stopped or turned. This is hunting behavior. Deliberate, calculated predatory behavior directed at the largest land animal in North America by a person walking barefoot through mud 23 years ago. A third sequence shows a group of what appear to be children or teenagers playing near the lakeshore. Footprints that jump, change directions, circle back, and overlap in the chaotic pattern of play rather than purposeful walking. Children playing by a lake during the Ice Age, in a land that was supposed to be empty. These are not artifacts. They are not tools that could have been washed downriver from somewhere else. They are not ambiguous marks that could be interpreted as natural formations. They are human feet pressed into mud 23,000 years ago. You can count the toes. You can see where a mother's weight shifted. You can see where a child took its first steps in the New World 10,000 years before the New World was supposed to have any children in it. The critical question was always going to be the dates, and the fight over those dates has been one of the most vicious in modern archaeology. Footprints do not come with timestamps. You cannot radiocarbon date a footprint. It is an impression in dirt, not an organic object. You cannot slice off a piece of a footprint and put it in a mass spectrometer. The impression itself is just absence, the space where a foot used to be. So the researchers dated the footprints indirectly, using the only organic material available in the same sediment layers. Seeds from the aquatic plant Rupia serosa, spiral ditchgrass, tiny seeds, no bigger than a grain of rice that were found embedded in the exact same layers of mud that contained the footprints. The logic is simple and sound. If the seeds are in the same layer as the footprints, they were deposited at the same time. Date the seeds, and you date the footprints. Radiocarbon dating of those seeds returned ages between 21,000 and 23,000 years before present. The paper was published in Science, one of the two most prestigious scientific journals in the world, in September 2021. The peer review was rigorous, the methodology was solid, the dates were clear, and the backlash was immediate and brutal. Critics raised a legitimate concern, one that the researchers themselves had anticipated, but that the opponents weaponized with a ferocity that surprised even seasoned academics. Aquatic plants like Rupia absorb dissolved carbon from the water they grow in, not from the atmosphere. If the lake water contained ancient carbon leached from old limestone bedrock, a phenomenon called the hard water effect or freshwater reservoir effect, the plants would incorporate that ancient carbon into their tissues. The result, the seeds would appear thousands of years older than they actually are. The dating could be off by exactly the margin needed, roughly 10 zeros-n years, to bring the footprints back into line with the Clovis first model. The critics were not saying the footprints were fake. They were saying the dates were wrong. And if the dates were wrong, the entire paper collapsed. It was a serious objection. And the researchers knew it was coming. They had discussed the hard water effect in their original paper. They had argued that the local geology, volcanic rather than limestone, made significant hard water contamination unlikely. But unlikely is not impossible, and in science, especially when you are overturning half a century of consensus, unlikely is not good enough. So they went back to white sands. And they looked for something else to date, something that was not aquatic, something that could not be affected by the hard water effect under any circumstances. They found conifer pollen, terrestrial pollen from pine trees that grew on the surrounding mountains and blew into the lake sediments on the wind. Pine pollen absorbs its carbon from the atmosphere, not from water. It has zero exposure to dissolved ancient carbon. It is immune to the hard water effect. They collected pollen grains from the same sediment layers as the footprints, grains so small they had to be extracted under a microscope, and radiocarbon dated them. The results were published in Science in October 2023. The pollen dates confirmed the seed dates, between 21,000 and 23,000 years old. The hard water objection was dead in the water. But the researchers did not stop there. They knew one confirmation would not silence the critics. They needed overkill. They needed a method that had nothing to do with carbon at all. In 2025, a third independent team applied optically stimulated luminescence, OSL, a dating technique that measures not organic material but the quartz, grains in the sediment itself. OSL works by measuring the amount of radiation energy trapped in the crystal structure of quartz grains since they were last exposed to sunlight. When a grain of sand is buried, it starts accumulating radiation energy from the surrounding soil. The longer it has been buried, the more energy it contains. By measuring that energy in a laboratory, you can calculate how long the grain has been underground. The process is extraordinarily precise when combined with AI-enhanced statistical analysis. The AI processes the luminescence signals from thousands of individual quartz grains simultaneously, identifies outliers caused by incomplete bleaching or post-depositional mixing, and calculates a statistically robust age with quantified uncertainty. The OSL dates confirmed the radiocarbon dates, 3 independent methods, 3 different materials, seeds, pollen, quartz, 3 different labs, 3 different physical principles, radiocarbon decay, atmospheric carbon uptake, and radiation dosimetry, all converging on the same answer. These footprints are between 21,000 and 23,000 years old. There is no hard water effect in quartz grains. There is no contamination argument that works across all 3 methods simultaneously. The dates are real, the footprints are real, and the Clovis first model, the foundation of American prehistory for over half a century, is finished. The implications of the White Sands footprints are difficult to overstate. They do not just push back the date of human arrival in the Americas by 10 zillion years. They force a complete rethinking of how humans got here, what they were capable of, and what the Americas looked like when they arrived. The Clovis first model says humans crossed from Siberia to Alaska via the Bering land bridge, a stretch of land now submerged, that connected the 2 continents when sea levels were lower during the Ice Age, and then walked south through an ice-free corridor between the Laurentide and Cordoran ice sheets. That corridor, running roughly along what is now the border between Alberta and British Columbia, opened around 14,000 to 13,000 years ago as the glaciers retreated. If humans were already in New Mexico 23,000 years ago, they could not have come through that corridor. It did not exist yet. It was sealed under a mile of solid ice. There was no way through the middle of the continent. So how did they get there? The leading alternative hypothesis is the Pacific Coastal Route, sometimes called the Kelp Highway. The idea is that early humans traveled from East Asia down the Pacific coast, following the productive kelp forest ecosystems that would have fringed the edge of the ice sheets. These kelp forests, rich in fish, shellfish, and marine mammals, would have provided a continuous food source along the entire route from Japan to Patagonia. The travelers would have moved by watercraft, skin boats, dugout canoes, or simple rafts, hopping from island to island, headland to headland, following the food. This route would not require an ice-free interior corridor, but it would require something that changes our understanding of ancient human capability: maritime technology during the Ice Age. Boats, navigation, the ability to survive in cold, rough, open water, the ability to read tides and currents, the ability to land on hostile, unknown coasts and survive 23,000 years ago, during the worst climatic period in the last 100,000 years. And there is evidence, growing evidence, that this is exactly what happened. In 2020, archaeologists at the Cooper's Ferry site in Idaho found stone tools and animal bone fragments dating to 16,500 years ago, over 3 zillion years before Clovis, with tool technology that more closely resembles tools found in Japan than anything in the Clovis toolkit. In Chile, the Monte Verde site has been dated to at least 14,500 years ago. In Brazil, the Pedra Ferrada rock shelter contains what some researchers believe are hearths and stone tools dating to over 20,000 years ago, though these dates remain contested. In the Channel Islands off California, human bones dated to 13 zillion years ago show that people were navigating open water to reach islands that were never connected to the mainland, even at the lowest sea levels. The problem is that the coastline these travelers followed 23,000 years ago is now under 300 feet of water. Post-glacial sea level rise submerged the entire continental shelf. Every campsite, every landing beach, every village these coastal migrants built is now on the ocean floor, inaccessible to conventional archaeology. The evidence of their journey was erased by the sea that carried them. That is why the White Sands footprints matter so much. They are the proof that survived. Not because they were on the coast, they are hundreds of miles inland, but because they were made in mud that turned to stone at an elevation too high for the sea to reach. They are a fragment of a much larger story, a story of a migration that covered thousands of miles over thousands of years, that was almost entirely erased by rising oceans. Without these footprints, we would have no proof that anyone was here before the ice melted. With them, we know that the entire history of human migration to the Americas needs to be rewritten. The AI-enhanced luminescence dating at White Sands does not just confirm the age of the footprints. It forces us to accept that the people who made them had ancestors who traveled thousands of miles through some of the most hostile environments on the planet, either along ice-choked coasts or across open ocean, at a time when most of humanity was huddled in caves waiting for the glaciers to retreat. They did not wait, they moved, and they left their mark in a place that preserved it for 23 millennia. And there is another implication that few people talk about, but that matters enormously. If humans were in the Americas 23,000 years ago, They coexisted with the megafauna mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, saber-toothed cats, dire wolves, American lions, short-faced bears, and dozens of other species that went extinct between 13,000 and 10,000 years ago, for at least 10,000 years longer than previously thought. The footprints at White Sands show humans and mammoths walking in the same place at the same time. One track shows a human stalking a mammoth. Others show humans walking parallel to mammoth tracks without apparent hostility. That is not simple predation. That is a complex ecological relationship that lasted thousands of years. The overkill hypothesis, the idea that human hunters drove the megafauna to extinction within a few centuries of arriving, has always been one of the dominant explanations for the Pleistocene extinction. But if humans and mammoths coexisted for 10,000 years before the megafauna collapsed, the overkill model becomes much harder to defend. Something else must have contributed: climate change, habitat loss, disease, and the role of humans may have been less decisive than we assumed. The White Sands footprints do not just rewrite the story of when humans arrived. They rewrite the story of everything that happened after they got here. There is something deeply uncomfortable about the White Sands discovery that goes beyond academic debate. It forces us to confront how much of what we call established science is actually just the best guess of a particular generation of researchers built on the evidence that was available at the time and defended long past the point where new evidence should have changed the story. The Clovis first model was not just a hypothesis, it was orthodoxy. For decades, any researcher who proposed an earlier date for human arrival in the Americas was marginalized, defunded, or professionally destroyed. The archaeological establishment defended Clovis first with a ferocity that had less to do with evidence and more to do with institutional inertia and ego. Careers were built on it, textbooks were written around it, museum exhibits were designed for it, and anyone who challenged it was treated not as a scientist with a different hypothesis, but as a heretic. Tom Dillehay, the archaeologist who excavated Monte Verde in Chile and found evidence of pre-Clovis occupation dating to at least 14,500 years ago, faced years of professional hostility before his dates were accepted. His colleagues questioned his methods, his funding was threatened, his work was dismissed at conferences. He spent a decade defending himself against attacks that were less about science and more about protecting the consensus. Jacques Cinq-Mars, who found evidence of human presence in the Yukon dating to 24,000 years ago at the Bluefish Caves in the 1970s, was effectively ostracized from the field for decades. His work was ignored, his dates were dismissed as contamination, and his career suffered permanent damage. He was right. The dates were confirmed by later analysis. But by the time vindication came, his most productive years were behind him. Both were eventually proven correct. But the cost of defending orthodoxy over evidence was measured in careers destroyed, knowledge suppressed, and decades of wasted time during which the wrong story was taught to millions of students. The irony is savage. The Clovis first model was itself once a radical idea. When it was proposed in the 1930s, it was attacked by established archaeologists who believed humans had been in the Americas for far longer. The Clovis advocates fought for their model, they won, and then as they became the establishment, and the establishment always protects itself. The White Sands footprints, confirmed by AI-enhanced dating and 3 independent methods, are the final nail in a coffin that should have been closed years ago. Humans were in the Americas at least 23,000 years ago. The Clovis model is wrong, and the story of human migration is far more complex, far more ancient, and far more impressive than any textbook currently in print describes. A child was carried across a lake bed in New Mexico 23,000 years ago. A teenager walked alongside a mammoth. An adult walked the same path day after day, week after week, leaving tracks in the mud that would survive longer than the civilization that eventually grew from their descendants. And a machine, 23 zillion years later, counted the quartz grains in the sand and said they were here. They were real. And they were here 10 zillion years before you thought that was possible. If you went to school in the United States at any point in the last 50 years, you learned that humans arrived in the Americas about 13,000 years ago. You learned about the Clovis people. You learned about the Bering land bridge. You might have seen a map with a neat arrow pointing from Siberia to Alaska to the Great Plains, as if thousands of people walked in a straight line from one continent to another like a guided tour. It was clean, it was simple, it made sense, and it was wrong. The White Sands footprints are not a theory. They are not a hypothesis waiting for confirmation. They are not an artifact that could have been misidentified or a tool that could have been washed downstream from another location. They are not statistical models or computer simulations. They are human feet pressed into mud. You can see the toes, 5 on each foot, spread wide from a lifetime of walking barefoot. You can see the arches higher than modern Americans, shaped by terrain and movement patterns we cannot reconstruct. You can see where a mother's weight shifted as she adjusted the child on her hip. You can see where a teenager stepped inside a mammoth's footprint to mask their approach. You can see where children played by a lake that no longer exists. And 3 independent dating methods, it's radiocarbon on seeds, radiocarbon on pollen, An AI-enhanced optically stimulated luminescence on quartz say those feet walked that ground 23,000 years ago. During the last glacial maximum, when the world was at its coldest, when ice sheets 2 miles thick covered everything from the Rockies to the Atlantic, when New Mexico was not a desert but a grassland at the edge of a lake surrounded by animals so large they make African elephants look modest. That means someone, or a very long line of someones, generation after generation, century after century, traveled from Asia to the Americas during the peak of the Ice Age. They crossed thousands of miles of coast or ocean in boats made of animal skin and driftwood. They navigated without maps, without compasses, without any of the tools we consider essential for ocean travel. They survived in temperatures that would kill an unprepared modern human in hours. They found food in kelp forests and on rocky shores. They made landfall on a continent that no human being had ever seen, and they walked inland into an unknown landscape populated by predators larger than anything alive today, and they survived. They did not just survive, they thrived. For at least 2,000 years, from 23,000 to 21,000 years ago, they lived beside this lake. They hunted mammoths, they raised children, they played. They walked paths so often that their footprints wore grooves into the mud. They built a life in a world that was trying very hard to kill them, and then they vanished from the record. The lake dried up, the mud turned to stone. The footprints were buried under dunes of white gypsum, and for 21,000 years, nobody knew they had ever been there. We do not know their names. We do not know their language. We do not know what they called this place. We do not know their stories, their songs, their gods. We do not know if their descendants survived to become any of the peoples who inhabited the Americas when Europeans arrived thousands of years later, or if their lineage ended in some forgotten catastrophe between then and now. But we know they were here, because they left their footprints in the mud. And the mud remembered what the history books forgot. There is a lesson in that, not just for archaeology, but for all of us. The things we are most certain about are often the things we are most wrong about. The consensus that felt unshakable for 50 years dissolved in the time it takes a machine to count the photons trapped in a grain of sand. The experts who said impossible were not lying. They were working with incomplete data. And the data was incomplete because they were not looking in the right place. The AI looked, it counted the quartz, it confirmed the pollen, it validated the seeds. And it said what the mud had been saying for 23,000 years. They were here, they were real, they were human, and they were here 10,000 years before you thought that was possible. Subscribe, because the story of human origins is being rewritten right now, not by historians in offices, but by machines that can read the age of a grain of sand. And what they are finding beneath our feet is older, deeper, and more extraordinary than anyone imagined. The next file is on your screen.